Welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series. We're already in November of 2017, so we're almost at the end of the series for this year. Today's session is by Linda Corrin and Paula Barba from the University of Melbourne, and they'll be talking about students' preferences for assessment feedback via personal analytics solutions. So I believe, Linda, you're going to begin?
Yes, thank you, Matthew. So thank you both to you, Matthew, and to Geoff for having us along. This is actually our second time that we've given a webinar through your particular seminar series, and it's really fantastic to, well, firstly be asked back, but also in such wonderful company of the quality of other seminars that you do run. So this time we've left behind Gregor Kennedy, who often comes along with us for the work that we do, but I just wanted to mention him briefly because he has been a mentor on this project. So now let me just see if I can move the slide to the first one. Here we go. So this is our title slide. So what we're going to do today is take you through the project that we have been working on together. So I'll be doing some of the talking, and I'll hand over to Paula to do some of the talking as well. I'm guessing if you've got any questions that come up throughout the presentation, please do feel free to add them to the chat box, and we'll try and address them as we go through, or else you can leave your questions to the end, but it's probably best to ask them when they're fresh in your mind. So I guess we should start by saying how we ended up doing this project, because the history of the project is quite interesting, and where we're taking the project next, we probably are not quite as clear, but certainly where it came from is very clear. And really what it came from was a grant that Paula and I worked on about 3 or 4 years ago now. It was an early career grant that was given to us through the University of Melbourne. And the idea was that because we knew that people were using learning analytics, which of course was the big buzzword of the time and to some extent still is, to deliver feedback to students, we wanted to understand a little bit about how students interpreted this feedback. So we kept seeing these tools that were being built that were called dashboards, and there were lots of different varieties of these, and a lot of the vendors were putting these out, so Blackboard and Moodle and Desire to Learn. They were all in the midst of trying to create dashboards to give feedback to students on their learning. And I guess the question that we wanted to ask was, well, can students actually interpret this feedback that was delivered through the dashboards? We'd spoken to a lot of teachers by this stage who were a little bit skeptical about whether or not students had the ability, both from a sort of digital literacy and a literacy around the use of statistics and visualizations, but also just whether or not students were able to understand this kind of feedback and apply it to their own situation, to be able to amend and adjust their study strategies in order to improve their learning. So we did this study. We didn't actually have a real live dashboard. So we just made one up. And we weren't trying to make a perfect dashboard. We were just trying to make something that represented the kinds of data that are often given to students as a representation of what they're doing online and also in their assessments. So it looks something like this. I know that's not a wonderful representation, or it's a bit grainy at the moment, but what it says doesn't really matter so much, other than the fact that it was very much based on the types of activities that they were doing in different subjects within their study. And we customized the particular dashboard representations for the different designs of the learning and assessment within each of the student subjects. And overall, in response to this question of whether or not students could interpret feedback delivered in this way, the answer really was, well, sometimes. But we did learn a lot about the types of things that students wanted, the sorts of things that they were getting that they weren't necessarily being able to understand or interpret effectively. And what we really started to question was their understanding of feedback, and really what would be the most useful type of feedback to deliver to them. So we decided that what we'd do really was to take a step backwards and to say, well, you know, we've kind of skipped ahead here. We've looked at learning analytics, we've thrown a dashboard at them, we've kind of given them the final product, but we haven't really understood what they need or what they want in the first place. Now, obviously, we're not advocating that we should just build systems on what students want. They don't always know and want what is best for their learning. But at the same time, we thought it would be a useful discussion to have to investigate this in a little bit more detail. So that's why we set up this particular project, was to be able to investigate this in a little bit more detail, to really get to the heart of what is feedback and how do students view feedback and how do they see feedback as being useful to them in their study. So if we have a look at what feedback is, when Paula and I started this particular project, we looked for a definition of feedback, and we went to, all the big names, and we came across the definition that was given by Hattie and Timberley in 2007. And they defined feedback as being information provided by an agent regarding aspects of one's performance or understanding. And they defined agent as being a teacher, a peer, a book, a parent, or themselves. And I guess this idea of using analytics was sort of putting in another aspect of what the agent could be. Maybe the dashboard was the agent, or maybe not, because it's still feedback delivered through or provided by some other person. But anyway, it started our thinking around this, and we wanted to see whether or not students had a similar way of thinking about feedback, or how they thought about feedback. And of course, when you go to the feedback literature, you get lots of different elements of what makes effective feedback and how that feedback can impact learning. So, there are lots of recommendations around the fact that feedback should be timely, it should be specific, it needs to be able to provide some action that the student can take forward into their future work. It needs to be informative, clear, fair, tailored. You've heard, I'm sure that the people in the webinar room, if I can call it that, have heard these sorts of things before and have probably engaged with some of this literature. So we sort of have an idea of some of the elements that we think are useful in designing feedback. But again, we wanted to get a little bit more of an idea of what the students thought about these particular things and how that worked together. So before we get into what the actual study is, I want to pass over now to Paula, because Paula will give us a little bit more background about the theoretical framework that we used to inform the study before we get into what the study actually looked like. So Paula, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Linda. Hello, everyone. What I'm going to talk about now is about self-regulation. So one critical aspect of the link between feedback and improved learning outcomes was the student's ability to self-regulate their learning. So I'll quickly run through one of the most used models of self-regulation in research currently. So when I'm talking about self-regulated learning, I'm talking about students being an active agent in their learning process. So this means that students high in self-regulation, they set goals, they select the most appropriate learning strategies, and then monitor and control their own learning progress. In Zimmerman's model, he proposes that the self-regulation cycle occurs in 3 phases. So the first one is the forethought phase, and it's when students are preparing to engage with the task. So processes within that phase include, for example, understanding the nature of the task, planning what learning strategies they will use, and how meaningful the task is to them. And then we have the performance phase, which is when they are engaging with the task itself. And in this phase, students are monitoring whether their strategies are working or not, if their levels of effort are adequate, and what they can do to adapt to the current learning situation. And the third phase is the self-reflection. So it's just when students make judgments about their learning experience that influences their future approach to learning. And high-achieving students, they use feedback as a catalyst for the self-regulatory processes. That is, these students use feedback to inform all of these processes mentioned here in Zimmerman's model. So one important aspect of feedback being useful or not is that students need to interpret that feedback received to impact the whole self-regulation cycle. So if students misinterpret feedback, this can actually hinder their learning rather than improving it. So that's a key concept to our study. So once we provide feedback to students, we're expecting them to interpret and perceive it in a way that will improve their learning, but not always that might occur or not. Linda, back to you now to talk about more of the research aims.
Thanks, Paula. So coming back to what we were saying before, we really thought in order to really help us understand how learning analytics in particular could be used to provide and support the feedback process, we really wanted to understand more about this idea of feedback and students' perceptions. So the aim of the research was really to get some guidance from students or some input from students about the type and usefulness of assessment feedback that they would find useful across the different stages of their studies over a semester. Now, one of the reasons that we've used the word assessment in particular was partly because this particular project of research was funded by the OLT, and they did have a preference on assessment studies in the particular year that we applied for this research funding. However, that was actually a useful lens through which to look at this, because obviously most of the feedback that we give to students throughout a semester does tend to be linked to assessment in one way or another. And so that's why we have that there as our key focus. But we were also really interested in the fact that we had a sense that students' perceptions of feedback may change over time. But it's something that's not always reported a lot on in the literature. So most studies that we found of students' perception of feedback tended to be at one point in time. So they're usually done perhaps in the form of a survey that's given to students at a particular point of time. It may ask them to reflect over a period of time, but it still is only at one period, at one point where they're actually asked to fill this in. Or else a lot of them actually are done within focus groups, so groups of students getting together and sharing their feedback perceptions. So we wanted to be a little bit different in the fact that we wanted to be able to follow students over a period of time and see how their opinions and their wants and needs in terms of feedback changed. Now, I must admit, we did submit a paper on this recently, and we did call it a longitudinal study, but our reviewer came back saying, well, you can't really say it's a longitudinal study if it's only one semester. However, we hope that even just doing one semester is interesting, and some of the changes in perspectives that we saw over just that brief period of time were also quite interesting. But to go into a little bit more detail about the types of things that we were looking at in particular, we wanted to really investigate the type of feedback that students were interested in, whether that be summative or formative. The granularity, were they interested in feedback that's at a sort of broader subject or even degree level, or were they interested at feedback that was more at the micro task level or even part of tasks, subtasks? The form that they wanted that feedback to take, how the feedback was going to be delivered. I just have to notice here Geoff saying might feel like a long time for students. I would definitely agree with that. A semester does seem like a long time sometimes. Right, and speaking of time, time was also the thing about when they wanted to get this feedback, and not necessarily just how close to the assessment task, but were there particular times during semester that feedback would be most useful or not. And that leads us into the frequency of how often they'd like to receive feedback on their work across the semester. So, in order to do this, and of course, as Paula was saying before, the impact on learning strategies was something that we were really interested in doing. We did this a little bit in our dashboard study to see, we spoke to students about, if they saw a dashboard, how would they change their learning strategies, or would they change their learning strategies? Would they stay the same? And we wanted to get to a similar sort of thing in this study to see whether or not the things that they want, they're asking for in particular reasons for this to impact learning strategies. So the method that we used, we had 30 undergraduate students, and the data was collected in the academic year of 2016. The students were from across first to fourth year. They were roughly split between first, second, and third year, and we had one student who was technically fourth year because they were on an exchange program. So if you sort of think of it as a third split over each of the year groups. And the students came from across 5 different disciplines within the university. The data obviously was collected at the University of Melbourne, but we tried to have a very broad sample here to get a really good picture of feedback across the university. So we then interviewed the students 4 times. The first interview took place in week 2, and we asked the students in this interview a little bit about their background, their academic background, and their demographic details, the details of the subjects that they were taking. I know different universities will call these things different things, units, courses. At the University of Melbourne, we call them subjects. So we wanted some details about their subjects and the assessment in particular that was attached to these subjects. We also wanted to get from them a little bit of an idea of the goal that they had for those subjects. So basically, what kind of outcome were they expecting in these subjects? Were they aiming for a really high mark? Were they aiming just to pass? What were they really trying to get out of the particular subjects in which they were enrolled? And then we asked them a very general question about what their ideal feedback was. So we basically said, what kind of feedback would you like to receive that you think would be most useful for your learning? And it was interesting at that point to see the responses, because they were quite varied. And a lot of students actually really did struggle a little bit to work out what we meant by feedback at that point. But we'll come back to that when we talk a little bit more about the findings. The second interview that we did took place in week 6. And what we did at that particular interview is we started by saying, well, have you received any feedback up until this point? At this particular point in semester, there were a number of students who hadn't really received anything that they considered to be feedback by this stage. If they had received feedback, we asked them about whether or not that feedback had had any impact on the way that they went about studying and approaching their learning. We then asked them to revisit the idea of what they had given us before in terms of ideal feedback. So we said, from what you've received so far, is there any change you'd like to make to what you said you wanted in terms of feedback for the particular assessment tasks and subjects that they had in that particular semester? And then we asked them to do the palette task. Now, you may ask what a palette task is, and I'll show you. So what we did is we gave the students a piece of blank paper, a very large piece of blank paper, and we basically said, could you draw us feedback that would be really useful to you at this point in the semester? And to help with this particular task, we gave students some pre-made visualizations that they could use, just various things. There wasn't any text on them or anything like that. It was something that students could choose from if they wanted to. We also said that they were quite free to just draw their own graphics or pictures or words or whatever they'd like as well. And so we gave this to them to do, and we asked them, whilst they were doing this particular activity, if they would use what we call the think aloud process. So we wanted them to just talk to us and explain to us their thinking as they were putting together this particular palette. And again, we'll show you some of these as we go through the finding section so that you get a sense of what they came up with, because what they came up with was very, very interesting and also quite varied. The third part of our method here was in week 10, we did a third interview with the students. The third interview looked very much like the second interview. So we reviewed feedback that the students had received between weeks 6 and 10. Again, we asked them whether or not that had had any impact on the way that they approached their studies. Again, we asked them to revisit the idea of the feedback, the ideal feedback that they wanted. And in this case, it's quite interesting because some students were able to sort of say, no, I'm happy with what I said before. And other students said, well, actually, now that I've seen the type of assessment, or now that I've had this particular feedback, perhaps I'd like something different, something more, something less. And of course, we asked them to do the palette task again. Now, in this case, we actually gave them the palette that they had before, and we said to them, look, you can either enhance this or change this, or you could have a blank slate. And a number of different students chose different pathways. One particular student that I interviewed actually took their palette from the second interview, screwed it into a ball, threw it over his shoulder, and then started from scratch, because his ideas around feedback had changed quite significantly between week 6 and 10. And then at the end of the semester, after the students had received their final grades for their subject, we then did a very short interview, some face-to-face and some via phone, because by this time students were often off campus or gone home for the summer or for the break. And we basically just asked them to reflect on the feedback that they had received across the semester. Now, we understand that by participating in study, We probably made students think more about feedback than they had previously, and several of the students actually made that comment to us to say, I've never really thought about feedback before, and certainly not in this much depth, but this study has really made me think about how I deal with feedback and what feedback I want. So we tried to capture some of that conversation in the fourth interview with students, but generally that was just kind of a short interview summarising their general views across the whole semester. So, any questions at this point? No? Okay. Well, in that case, I will move on to the findings. So we had a number of different findings that emerged from the study at this point. And when we look at the type of feedback that students want, there were lots of comments about the fact that students tend to get marks and grades, and some students tend to get much more comments. But the thing about wanting more comments and wanting more feedback that goes into detail about what the student had done right or wrong. And of course, it isn't always what they've done wrong. They often wanted some feedback on what was right, just to confirm that they had been on the right track. But often they were only given a mark or grade, especially in some of the more science-based subjects, where they just got their mid-semester tests, their final exams, their online tests, and it was just you got 7 out of 10, and that was it kind of thing, without any ability to see which questions they got right or wrong and to be able to work out where the gaps were that they may need to address. Right. Oh, Matthew's asked a question. Is there any comment about comments directing to me to how I can do better? Yes, a lot of comments about that. And again, we'll come back to that question soon in some of the later findings. In terms of granularity, we didn't find many students who were really interested in looking at that high level of feedback. We had expected some that would want to sort of see their overall progress through a degree, or to sort of get something that's more at a subject or across different subjects. And we didn't see as much evidence of that. Just coming back to Jeff's question, disappointing for students that they receive a mark or grade and nothing else. Yes, that is true. And a lot of them were disappointed, and several of them were quite angry, I must say. There was one particular student who was the last student we actually interviewed. And yes, his final interview went for almost an hour and a half because he spent a lot of time talking about how disappointed or how angry he was about not receiving feedback that he could do anything with. He said, a grade just doesn't tell me anything. I need to know what I can do to improve. Sally's asked, did any get comments without a grade, and if so, what was the verdict? Oh, Paula, you said indeed that was still common. Yes, needs to be actual advice, says Mathew, yes. From what I've seen so far of the thing, I don't think any of them got the comments without the grade. I know that that's happening more and more across different assessments now, but certainly not in the students that we dealt with in this particular study. Right, coming back, so granularity, it was very much at the task level. Students were really interested in individual tasks, individual assessments, getting something about the task itself, certainly the requirements about the task, and also how they were progressing in a task. So in some cases, students had assessment tasks that had multiple parts, and being able to see the progress through that was very important to students, but really being able to understand what the task was asking before the assessment needed to be submitted was almost more important to students than receiving any feedback or comments after the task was completed. And again, we'll come back to that comment in a little bit more detail through all the sections as well. Now, what was really interesting was that a lot of students wanted face-to-face feedback. Certainly the first year students, but it was common across all of the different year levels. And when we asked them about their ideal feedback, a lot of it was face-to-face. I want to be able to talk to the lecturer. I want to be able to spend more time with my tutor. And it was interesting too that students were able to kind of see that logistically that was not always possible, especially in subjects with large cohorts of students. But that was certainly, if they had, in an ideal world, that would have been their preferred form of feedback. We have a question about, did any students experience video feedback? Again, not in the study. I know that it is used in our university, but we didn't come across any in this particular study. I think a couple did have audio feedback though. Now, in terms of time and frequency, one of the things that was quite common in the ways that some of the subjects were designed was that there were very, very big, high risk, or high stakes, I should say, not high risk, high stakes assessment tasks that tended to happen mid-semester and end of semester. Some subjects have very traditional kind of a mid-semester test and a final exam, or else in the more arts-based subjects, they had a mid-semester essay and a final essay. And students felt that because these tasks were so far apart, and in the case of the final exams or final essays right at the end of semester, that they just weren't being able to get enough feedback at a time that was useful to them to be able to actually action it within that subject. So a lot of the student feedback was really about breaking bigger assessments into smaller parts so that there could be more frequent feedback. And again, that came across a number of different, across a number of the cases with our students here. So really, I guess in summary, there were a lot of previous experiences that students had of feedback, so certainly through high school for those first year students, but also for the second and third year students, they'd had a lot of different feedback experiences throughout the subjects that they'd taken previous to the semester in which they were part of this study. And that did influence the way that they approached how they studied, but also the feedback that they requested. But really, the thing that I guess it shouldn't surprise us, but it's certainly something that really came through as a key idea here was about the task interpretation. So coming back to Paula's framework around self-regulated learning, task interpretation is a very key element of that. And the students kept saying, you know, it's too late after we've done the task to give us feedback. We need more feedback about how we're preparing for task, how we're approaching this task. Sometimes it was just clearer instructions about what was required from the assessment. In a slightly sadder note, we did have one student who sort of said, I want to know how to do the task, obviously, but I also want to know what this particular lecturer wants, because I know that their expectations are probably going to be very different to the lecturer I had last semester. So a lot of this comes back to how we design assessment and how we communicate that assessment to students. And so hopefully if our assessment is well designed, it really shouldn't matter who's marking it, and we shouldn't be giving students the impression that they have to be writing to a particular individual's wants. So I guess that was a really interesting point that was raised by one particular participant there. So, Paula, would you like
take over from here?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Linda. So this is one of the, I think one of the interesting findings, very surprising to us, because as Linda was talking, we had the expectation, we did the design revolving around the semester. So we wanted to see if feedback perspectives changes across the semester. But what we found was actually that feedback perspectives changed across year levels. And we found, for example, that first-year students mentioned their experience in high school as their benchmark for how feedback should function. So that means that they were relying on teachers to constantly chase them up to provide them feedback, and they were mostly on a face-to-face format. And there was no mention during the semester about them seeking feedback, so actively looking for ways to know how they're going. Although at the end of the semester, some students did mention that perhaps they could have, you know, been a little more active about seeking feedback, chasing up their tutors, or doing something to actually monitor their progress during the semester. In contrast, oops, I clicked, here we go. So in contrast, third-year students, they reported to rely more on their peers and the curriculum for feedback. So things like participating in study groups, that was very common, using peer review processes, either formal or informal, to get feedback for different assessment, or preparing to an assessment, and looking up for past exams. These were commonly mentioned strategies by third-year students. So this means that they didn't rely only on teachers, and they saw that face-to-face interaction with teachers and tutors as a last resource kind of approach to get feedback. But if they did need more feedback, they were very proactive about it. They would go to consultations and they would chase up that piece of information that would help them to monitor and improve their learning. So these findings suggest that over the years, students seem to adapt how they regulate their learning, more specifically how they seek for feedback, so how they arrange all their study strategies to get that feedback and especially learn from their peers. So it is important when considering how to provide feedback, also consider students' year level and this transition or movement in how feedback is provided to students across different year levels. So, for example, it might not be obvious for first-year students that, hey, I can go to my peers, or if I start a study group that will actually benefit me because I'm going to have limited access to my lecturers in this cluster, usually 1,000 students with me. So I'm going to pass on to the next findings. Linda, would you like to add anything to the perspective across year levels?
No, other than to say that it does create an interesting thing. We do see that students tend to adjust by third year because by that time they're more used to what is provided. And yet when we did talk to them about their ideal, they still did have that want to have more personalised face-to-face feedback from their teachers. So what they wanted and what they got perhaps was a little bit less aligned in third year than it was in first year. But again, sometimes that is due to the way that the courses are structured, the subjects are run, the assessment is designed. But it is interesting to see that slight mismatch there. We have a question here. Could this simply be a function of the fact that students' feedback at uni is different, hence students have to change their expectations? Yeah, that is part of the story as well. And the question, I guess, for us is how much should we support this transition, I guess you'd say, from having a very heavy reliance in the early years on the teacher or the tutor towards being a little bit more independent, seeking feedback themselves, and also collaborating with peers to develop feedback. One thing that didn't seem to come up a lot in our conversation with students was the idea of kind of self-assessment and providing feedback on their work using, getting students to perhaps use rubrics to look at their own work. We didn't see an awful lot of evidence of that amongst the students that we interviewed, but it's another part of this conversation about making students slightly more independent and self-sufficient in terms of feedback. So it's a question, I guess it'll continue on, about how much we guide, support and handholds, for want of a better word, students in this transition of feedback across the years. Yeah. Great. So, that's me moving on. So let's go to the next slide. Something that was probably a function of this particular setting that we were in. So we are obviously from the University of Melbourne. We use the Melbourne model in how we deliver our curriculums for undergraduate students. I forgot to mention before that our sample was only undergraduate students. We didn't look at postgraduate students in this study. And what it means is that under the Melbourne model, students generally do 3 core subjects a semester and 1 breadth subject. So that's a subject that's out of their main discipline. So it may be that they're studying science and they do their breadth subject in a language or in arts or in creative arts or something like that. We saw a number of students who were doing art subjects or science subjects that took a business breadth subject, for example, as well. So what was interesting is that means that people in this study didn't just get one discipline's perspective of assessment and assessment design. And that was an interesting thing to look at in terms of what students became used to and what was a little bit foreign to them in terms of how they approach their study and also how they approach doing particular assessments. So obviously we saw a disciplinary difference across the types of assessments. And of course that also in some ways different assessment led to different types of feedback. So that was quite interesting, and how students adapted to that. So students that came from arts-based subjects that were very essay-based had an interesting time sort of dealing with subjects that had slightly different assessment types, but also different ways of representing that feedback. So, and what was interesting too was that there seemed to be a lack of alignment between feedback and multiple assessments. So often the students were given 4 or 5 assessments throughout a semester, but because the assessments were all quite different and they were assessing different elements of the subject, it was often difficult for students to use the feedback from one assessment to inform their approach to another. Now again, this is not revolutionary, we've seen this in other studies. However, it was just interesting to see that really happening in practice. And then when you bring in the idea of different disciplines and going across different disciplinary areas and different assessments in those areas, it became even more noticeable that there was a lack of alignment between moving feedback from one subject to another subject as well, sometimes understandably and sometimes not so understandably. So, and of course that really was a function of the fact that the students were engaged in core and elective subjects in the kind of way that they were. So, right, I've lost the chat thing here because I see a lot of things are going on, but I'm assuming that Paula is answering all your questions as we go through. But I'm going to stop her from doing that and I'll pass her on to the next finding slide here. So Paula, over to you.
All right. So the next slide, comparison of feedback with peers. So this is something that we touched on previous studies, so on the dashboard study that Linda mentioned. We, by chance, included the class average in those dashboards that we produced in the previous study. And it was quite interesting to see how students were thrown off by that. So they would totally focus on what their peers were doing. So for this one, we were not that surprised when some students brought up the fact that they wanted to compare their own performance with their peers. But that came along with some mixed comments on their peer comparison. So the positive comments were usually around helping them to assess the difficulty of a task. So if they didn't go well in a task and all their peers didn't go well, then they would judge that task as being difficult and it's fine for me to not go well. But if they were way below the average and all their peers went okay, that would have a negative impact on their motivation. And also, some students commented that having the average shown to them and seeing how they were doing in relation to their peers would promote competition and hinder collaboration with other students. So, interestingly, when they were asked about the comparison of feedback with peers, they did mention some alternatives to peer comparisons. So they said, for example, that group level feedback presented during class was something that was very useful for them, and that's a practice that they did receive in some of their subjects. Another practice would be the use of students' own standards. So consider where they want to go and how far they are to achieve, for example, the grade that they want to. If they want an H1 or in other universities, if they want 100% or 80% on that grade, how far away are they on achieving that grade? So that would help them to manage their effort and know whether they are on the right track or not. And provide other standards was also something that they mentioned. So providing past exams so they could see what a good answer to an open-ended question would be good, or activities with answers where they could work out themselves, or alternatives to peer comparisons that would be a safe approach that would not hinder somehow their learning experience. So from a self-regulation point of view, so it is very important, as I believe Jessica was saying before on the comments, or Sally? No, Teresa, wow. So to provide standards is very, very important so they can make the judgment to then plan what's to come. So plan their next step. Am I doing well or am I not doing well? If I'm not doing well, then I can actually make some changes to my strategies to improve my learning. And that's it for the findings. Liz, I think you're taking over to present a case study for us.
Yes, so as we said before, there were 30 students in this study, and we have a lot of data about each of these students. So we knew that in this particular seminar, we wouldn't be able to go into everybody in detail. So we just picked up one particular student who we thought was an interesting case study. This is a first-year science student, and it was really interesting because when we tried to talk with the student about feedback, she really wasn't able to understand what we meant by feedback. So one of the things we didn't do in study, which often happens in studies where we talk to students about dashboards and we talk to students about learning analytics, and sometimes give them examples of things and then we ask their opinion. Where in this study, we didn't want to do that. We wanted to really get their understanding of how they see these things. And when we said, what's the feedback do you want? This particular student kept sort of saying, I'd like the assessment to be broken up into smaller parts, and I'd like to be able to do this, and I'd like to be able to do that. And each time we talk about feedback, she'd talk about assessment design. So that was an interesting thing that we found in this particular case. And of course, when we did talk about the things that she did receive after her assessment, she did talk about the fact she found it difficult to work out how to respond to that feedback or how to translate that feedback into something that she would then do differently for future tasks. When we asked her to draw her feedback, ideal feedback in the palette task, it was interesting that when we got her to do that the first time, which was in week 6, her focus was very much on, I want feedback that shows me how I'm doing myself and my progress and those sorts of things. It was less about comparing it to anyone else. It was more about her own personal goals and things like that. However, when we asked her the same questions in week 10 and we asked her to redo the palette task, she actually started to bring in more of a comparative element and wanting to see what her peers were doing. The other thing that she did comment on that was a little bit unusual, but we thought was quite interesting, was that she had done some particular breadth subjects and was so dissatisfied with the type of feedback that she received that she had decided not to continue with that particular line of study, and that she was going to seek a course on that particular element, which was a particular language, outside of the university, and that she would change her focus within her electives and her breadth subjects within the university. So it does show how much of an impact feedback can have on how students approach their study, but also how students approach their future selection of studies. But I guess I'm conscious of time, and I want to give Paula a bit of time to talk a little bit more about some of the visual elements. But I just wanted to show you this very quickly about the fact that when we asked students to draw the feedback that they wanted, and this is really where we're trying to get some insight into ways that we might represent this using analytics, using visualization, they were all very different. So as you can see from this slide here, there are a number that are quite busy. There's lots of elements on the page. They relate to different tasks and different parts of the task. They may relate to a subject overall. And then there are some, like the one in the middle on the bottom there, where they're very, very basic. And I remember interviewing a particular student, and they just said, no, that's all I need. I just give me a little bit of a thing that focuses on progress and a quick summary of my marks overall, and I'm fine. I've already got my strategies in place. I already know what I'm doing. This would just be an extra. It's not something I need. Whereas other students were very verbose about the things that they'd like to see. So I'm going to hand over to Paula now to talk us through some of the visual elements that we saw across the different palettes that the students drew for us.
Thanks, Linda. So I'll give you an idea of the different formats and what the students said they would be useful for. So here we have some alarm badges and calendars that students drew or got from the cutouts that we provided to them. So alarm and calendars, they were often used together to assist them in managing all subjects together, so all the units, including alerts on when to start working on an assignment, for example. And here on the bottom right, you can see the badges that they said they wanted, something like to use as a praise feedback, something like, there you go, good job grasping these concepts. Chat box. So on the left, the student emphasized the importance of chatting with peers on week 10. So they had used that chat box on week 6, and then they just on week 10 just highlighted that, this would be the most useful thing for me. And on the right here, we have the use of chat box integrated with other components such as discussion boards and such functions. They also used checklists just for daily tasks and to manage topics to improve, for example. Discussion boards is just the usual discussion board that you see, but with more feedback to them in the sense of, has the tutor or lecturer also commented on this, and how many threads I haven't seen yet within this certain topic. And newsfeed was a way that they signaled as to informally and casually chat with tutors, lecturers, and peers. Here are line charts that were used in different ways. So at the top, it's just progress throughout semester, and on the right is progress so on the first attempt and the second attempt of an online quiz. And the pie chart is just showing the percentage of strategies students use on an open-ended question. So for example, the blue was students, they used a drawing to answer that question, and that was considered a good answer, for example. Progress bars, so they were used to show progress in a specific topic or progress for working on a longer assignment. So for example, an assignment that has 5 stages, I already submitted 3, I only have 2 more to go. Radar diagram that was that was very popular, and usually students used to show points where they needed to improve, either related to content, so certain topics, or skills as well. Text area, so they use that for mainly essays, and they were quite happy with what is provided, for example, through Turnitin with the bubble boxes with the text feedback from tutors. Traffic lights, so the top left used traffic lights to signal progress over time for general skills like group work and presentation skills. The bottom left, on the other hand, used traffic lights as a grid to display formative activities separated by difficulty. So the first one would be, the first column would be easy activities, the second medium, and the last one challenging. So in this example, they did well in the easy and the medium, but not so much on the challenging. And on the right example, on the right side of the screen, they use traffic lights to represent the progress over time in specific topics. And finally, for video, they used the video to provide, was chosen to provide general feedback to all students, while on the right side one was to help students prepare for an oral presentation activity, so something about test clarification rather than feedback. So overall, students, they highlighted the importance of feedback to help them to better organize their time to study, to motivate them, to put them in contact with peers, to help them identify their weaknesses, and to prepare for specific tasks. And it is interesting to note here that students use the same visual representation for different purposes, but also use different visual representations for the same purposes. Linda?
Thanks, Paula. So I guess that's a really quick highlight summary of the findings that we have. As I said, it's a really rich data set, and it's something that we're working through at the moment to write up into something that we'll be able to hopefully distribute to everybody later on. But I guess in coming back to how we think about this, and David made a really interesting point in the chat earlier on about the alignment of our assessment and constructive alignment, and whether students have a really strong understanding of that or not. And I guess that's one of the things that we found is that they often don't, and we need to think about ways that we can help them to understand why the assessment is designed in the way it is and how it does align with the subjects overall. But one of the things that we did do in our thinking as we've been doing our analysis and starting to write some of this up was coming back to that definition of feedback that we used at the beginning by Hattie and Timberley about the age of providing the feedback. And we came across a little bit later on a definition of feedback by Bowd and Malloy that really talks about putting the learner at the center of the feedback process. And if we are using learning analytics to be able to provide feedback, certainly at scale, we do need to empower the learner to be able to take a little bit more ownership of this feedback process. And really, something that came through very strongly was a sense from all of our participants about being able to really understand what Bowd and Malloy say, the similarities and differences between the standards and the quality of the work itself. So it was something that we really started to identify with. So while the study was really trying to get an understanding of feedback to help us with analytics, we found a few very general considerations that we wanted to run through quickly. These are not rocket science and they're not necessarily new, but we just found them really important. Really was that idea that the way that students understand feedback really does vary. And if we do want to have conversations with students about feedback, it's important to understand whether or not they're on the same page as them when we're talking to them. So really the idea of signposting and supporting feedback is quite key here. That idea of pre-task feedback, or feed forward, as someone said earlier on the chat box, is something that students really highly value and often don't receive, or certainly the students that we did in this that we had in this particular study felt that they didn't. So again, it's about how we design assessment, how we design our broader subjects and learning designs, and how we could perhaps build feedback into the different stages of assessment tasks. Also, the understanding that students have, and also the expectations that they have around feedback evolve over time as they build more feedback experience. And it doesn't hurt for us to be having wider conversations about how we do deliver feedback across different subjects and across an entire degree, and in our case at the University of Melbourne, across different degree programs because of the breadth and core subjects that the students do. Often the feedback is very insulated within a subject, and there isn't always that conversation that occurs. I know other institutions, or even our own institution, probably do that in pockets, but it's certainly, I don't think, widespread. But if we want to bring it back to the considerations that we learned from this study in terms of delivering feedback through analytics, we found that students were very interested in things around progress and performance. We expected them to want to be able to see visualizations about how they had performed in particular assessment tasks and in particular subjects, but we were quite surprised about how much they wanted visualizations that represented their progress. How much of this have I done? How much more is there to go? If I want to hit this particular goal, what have I got to do to get to that particular goal? And some students had very sophisticated ways of monitoring this themselves already, but others didn't, and others were hoping that the technology and the analytics might be able to help in this particular way. But what we didn't see was them requesting clicks. We didn't see very much evidence of them saying, oh, I want to know whether I've logged in as much as my peers have logged in. I want to see things about when I've logged in and which things I've clicked on and that sort of thing. We didn't see as much evidence of that. And the reason that we bring this up is because that's often something in the learning analytics community that gets put in front of teachers and students a lot, is how often have you logged in, or when did you log in, or these sorts of things. And that wasn't as easy to, and wasn't as popular as we had expected, or not so much expected, it wasn't very popular amongst the students. And yes, as Mathew says, the easy to measure versus the important. What's easy to give them as opposed to what's actually going to make an impact on their learning. Obviously, we can see from the range of different palettes that we receive from the students and the conversations that we had with them that they have very different wants and needs. And I guess there's that idea of being able to give the students the ability to customize their feedback representations. And that can be done in relation to their own particular goals within their learning and within their subjects, their preferences for being able to see data in one format over another. So as Paula said before, often they would choose different visual elements, but they were still representing the same set of data. So could we build a system that perhaps says, if you want data on this particular element, you can have that. Would you like it as a bar chart or a line graph or something else? Maybe that's a little bit beyond the technologies that we have now, but it's perhaps something that you could do in the future. And it did bring to mind the study that was done at Curtin University recently, where the students there said that they did want to be able to customise what they received. However, they didn't want the university to always have the power to customise. So they wanted to be able to see everything if they chose, but then they wanted to be able to sort of filter that down into what was most useful. What they didn't want in that particular study was for students to be able to, so for some students to be able to see something and other students not to be able to see something. So being able to customise but maintain that equity was really important that came through in that particular study. And we saw similar kinds of themes coming through here. But the biggest thing, and it's the hardest thing if you're trying to build an automated feedback system, is really being able to link students to adequate support. So if they're seeing something coming through their analytics, if they do have a dashboard, they have some sort of report of the feedback, and they need to know what to do next, they can't really join the dots themselves, we need to be able to provide some way to help them to do that. And I guess that's still the holy grail of this particular area, is trying to work out ways that we can do that, especially at scale. So, but empowering the students to be able to do some of these processes themselves, being able to build things where students can seek support, and if from nowhere else, at least from their peers, that would be a start there. So I guess that's all we have time for in time for the time. I do apologise now, we've sort of gone a little bit over. I'm just trying to see if there's any last couple of questions that we could quickly look at here. Someone's asked about the findings here. Yes, we do have an Escalate paper that's been accepted to the conference that will be presented at the end of this month or the beginning of the next month. So that will be available online soon. And we are also putting together a final report for the OLT, so that will hopefully appear online in the next probably 6 weeks or so. We'd be happy to follow up with anybody who would like more information about what we find. And yes, as Matt said, the slides and recording are going up. And someone's moved me to the end slide because I'm obviously going over time. But if there's any final questions, please let us know.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. And Paula,
Lovely.
Interesting session. We can stick around for a while, that's not a problem. I'm just leaving your emails there for a minute. And then, of course, the final slide is please fill in our feedback form if you have yet to do so. That would be very great. I shall send the results of the feedback to Linda and Paula shortly. They may be interested to know your views.
Okay.
Right, so it looks like we are on the hour, so people are bugging out. That's great, fine. It is 7 o'clock over here in Melbourne. So
dinner time.
Yes, it's dinner time. Apparently I've got a roast pork waiting for me at home, so I'm getting out the door pretty quickly. Okay, well, I assume it's roast pork. It's pork with something, anyway. Okay, thank you, Linda. Thank you, Paula. I shall stop the recording. Any last words?
Oh, enjoy your breakfast, Jim.
Okay, thank you, and recording will be stopped.
Okay.
All right.